name is Vinika Devasar Rao. I'm a Singaporean national. I did my formative education in India, from all over the country actually, as my father was in the Indian Army, so I'm proud Army brat. I did my undergraduate degree from Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi and an MBA from IIM Bangalore. Over the years, I've added on some other qualifications and courses from other countries, including from INSEAD and from SEEBS. Sometime back, I also completed a doctorate from the Singapore Management University. When I look back at my career, I feel quite blessed that I had the opportunity and the willingness to take a step back while in the thick of a busy corporate leadership career, to think through what I really wanted to do, to feel more fulfilled at work. And this is probably what allowed my transition to education almost 14 years back. And more recently, it also guided the decision to take on a rather rigorous doctorate in business administration. And I can tell you it wasn't easy to take on a serious academic degree at this stage in my life and career on top of a full-time job. I had practically no free weekends for a long time, and there were many times when I questioned, this self-inflicted torture, so to speak. But ultimately, because I was studying a subject that was so close to my heart, it all seemed to be worthwhile. I started my career what seems like eons ago now with Citibank in India, and then I took on other roles across different industries and geographies, following pretty much the typical young MBA career path. My last two corporate roles were as general manager of an American-Asian joint venture in the field of industrial chemicals, and then as the managing director of an Indonesian conglomerate, before I made the serendipitous transition to education. And I think this is where I found my calling. So this is almost like a second career innings for me. Prior to joining INSEAD, I was Associate Professor of Strategy at the SP Jain Center, where I taught business strategy to MBAs and executive MBAs and conducted specialized programs for corporate clients. I've also taught at the Melbourne Institute of Technology, Curtin University and LPMI, as well as Murdoch University and Kaplan in Singapore. For the last decade or so, I've worked with INSEAD, which is a well-known global business school. I'm sure you're familiar with it. We're ranked among the top 5 in the world. Currently, I wear a few different hats at INSEAD. First, with the INSEAD Emerging Markets Institute, which focuses on knowledge creation and dissemination with a view to improving social and economic development in emerging nations. My second hat is with the INSEAD Gender Initiative, which seeks to integrate research, business and pedagogy to engage the full potential of women, but also men. And finally, my third hat is with the Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society, where our aim is to equip the business leaders of today and tomorrow to make decisions in ways that deliver positive outcomes for business, people, and the planet. And we hope that they'll do this by consciously integrating social impact into every aspect of their business value chains. I also sit on the board of a non-profit organization and an independent think tank. My own research interest is in the area of gender diversity in corporate leadership, specifically the impact of male supervisorial support on the self-regulating focus of mid-career female managers. That's quite a mouthful, even difficult for me to say. My other research interests are leadership diversity, millennials, and intergenerational influences on the workplace, as well as emerging market strategy. So we've all seen depressing statistics regarding gender diversity in the workplace. You would have read many of the articles that I've read. It's indicated in the low numbers of women on corporate boards and senior management teams worldwide. It's indicated in the wage gaps between equally qualified men and women holding similar jobs, and in the existence of the gender pyramid, which shows that the representation of women in the corporate workplace drops off as we go up the corporate ladder, even in industry sectors and companies and countries where things might start off rather well. We know there is a historical underrepresentation of women in corporate leadership, meaning in senior management and board positions, which is a serious problem for business all over the world and also in Asia. Because even as finding gender diverse leadership talent is a struggle, retention of the women who have been hired and trained is sometimes an even larger problem for companies. Corporate resources are substantially depleted every time you have an experienced female manager with years of expensive training, both on and off the job, making the decision to give up the fight. And she does this because the challenges associated with moving to the next levels of organizational leadership perhaps outweigh the perceived benefits. The worst part, I think, is that women tend to fall off just when they're at their most valuable, and therefore when it hurts the organizations the most. We have a lot of research that shows that it's the mid-career pre-leadership stage, which is a highly vulnerable one for women due to increased and often conflicting pressures on the personal and professional ends. When we talk about personal aspect, the personal challenges are to do with what social scholars call family formation, so marriage and maternity. And on the professional end, more senior roles come with greater advancement potentials, but also with more challenging responsibilities. So where the personal sacrifices are not countered by organizational and supervisorial enablers, which then make the leadership journey easier and more worthwhile, women may make the choice to leave. And when they do, the negative consequences to their employers are manifold, worth thinking about also. The companies miss out on diversity-related advantages for performance, for creativity, for innovation. There's a depletion of corporate resources spent on developing high-potential female talent. They lose out on the highly competitive war for leadership talent because you lost out on women who are half your workforce. You can lose out on investors who increasingly today are looking at leadership diversity as a decision-making factor. You take the risk of alienating other stakeholders, including your current and future employees and customers. And in some cases, you might even be flouting regulatory requirements. So the negatives are manifold to the companies that then lose out on female talent. This is a pandemic that has had truly global consequences. We can say no nation, no community, no business has really been left unscathed. And so as government and business leaders are struggling to ensure the survival of their nations and their companies, it is possible to overlook the less obvious but highly insidious effect that the pandemic is having on gender balance. Early evidence suggests that if business and government leaders fail to guide effectively, COVID-19 will disproportionately harm women. We've all seen headlines regarding what is going wrong with respect to gender-based inequities all over the world, from domestic violence increase to widening pay gaps, increased pressures to balance childcare with work, and governments reducing gender gap reporting requirements. So many different stories that express different dimensions to the threat of derailing the hard-earned and very slow progress that we've had so far towards gender equality. My colleagues at the INSEAD Gender Initiative recently conducted a survey to understand how people felt about this impact of the pandemic. And I'll share just one aspect of the findings from that, which I think are really relevant in this regard. When asked how they felt the future would be for gender balance post-COVID-19, 41% of the responders felt that the future will be worse for gender balance, and interestingly, 34% felt that it would actually be better. Now, if you just average out the responses, there's not much net change expected in the situation. But what's more interesting from a statistical standpoint, and I promise not to go into that in too much detail as far as stats are concerned, but what was found is that the researchers saw a bimodal distribution, meaning that there are actually fewer people sitting in the middle saying that there's no change, but there are more on either side saying either that there will be a change for the worse or that there will be a change for the better. Now, without going into specifics on the reasons for the responses on the positive and negative consequences, I just want to mention that interestingly, people sometimes viewed the same consequence of COVID-19 as having a positive impact, where others saw it as having a negative impact. So to take one quick example, the requirement of work from home, which came about as a result of this pandemic, which all of us had experienced. Now, some people saw the opportunity of greater flexibility for working women with the removal of the stigma attached to it, while others saw the challenge of women having to do a full job from home, while also managing the children who were being forced to stay away from school. And just to perhaps, if you allow me to go beyond the gender aspect, given what's happening in the world right now with regard to, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, achieving equity, diversity, and inclusion across all parameters, including race and gender, is a very important part of creating a better future for all. And businesses have as important a role to play in this as do governments and educational institutions. So I do want to say that I believe in the idea of an opportunity in every crisis, There are opportunities here with this pandemic that we can leverage to ensure that the hard-earned progress towards creating a more balanced society and workplace are not negated by the pandemic. For instance, one positive in this current crisis that has come out is that all kinds of data is being collated related to how different companies are reacting to the crisis and the impact of their actions on business and society. And because I'm also a firm believer in the maxim that what gets measured gets learned from, I do think that this data will be very helpful going forward, because it is clear that even after we finally recover from this current pandemic, which will happen one day, whether that comes from a vaccine or hopefully from socially responsible leadership from political and business leaders, there will be other health and economic pandemics in the future. So the lessons learned from this one can stand us in good stead for years, perhaps generations to come, provided we can put the equity, diversity, and inclusion agenda front and center. I think first and most importantly, be true to yourself. Women don't need to become like men to be successful. It's much more important that you capitalize on your relative strengths, whatever they might be. They could be higher EQ, they could be sensitivity, communication ability, or they could be some completely different strengths that you have. Capitalize on what you do best. The other point would be, don't be afraid to ask for what's due. A common recommendation in this regard is for women to speak up for what they believe in. And one example of when this becomes particularly required is salary negotiation, especially during mid-career moves, which is where my research interest primarily lies. I remember an HR head once told me in one of the interviews I was conducting for a research project, where she said that men definitely ask for raises more vocally and more frequently than women do. Now, the fact is you're more likely to get something if you ask for it. So do go ahead and do that. I'd also say, absolute zero tolerance of any overt or covert sexism. If you see it, call it out. The corporate environment today is generally very supportive in this regard. So there's no excuse to tolerate it for yourself or for anyone else. Another important point is to do with networking. Optimizing women's groups. They do provide a support network for sharing on common problems to counter the old boys network that men have forged over the years. So where they're available, use them. I know that there are sort of mixed views on whether women's networks help or not, but look, if they can be useful, you must try and do the best you can with them. And I think increasingly they're becoming more and more useful, not just because there are lots of women who help each other, there are also men who are active supporters in this regard. In fact, I did a set of interviews just quite recently for another research project, and I interviewed two men who were both the heads of the women's networks in their organizations as male champions, which was very interesting. The other point I'd make in a slightly different way is don't see barriers where they don't exist. I remember one of my female interviewees once told me something that has stuck with me, where she said perception can become reality. Women can jump to gender conclusions if they miss out on promotion without considering other possible explanations. So do keep an open mind on that. It's not always just because of your gender. One thing that bears, I think, particular relevance and which should be mentioned is about compensation, because I mentioned earlier salary negotiation. Now, women do sometimes feel shortchanged in compensation, and with good reason. We know that wage pay gaps do exist. So don't tolerate it if there's a gap. Be sure to bring it up and make sure that it is addressed. But again, don't make assumptions about it, because assumptions can be incorrect. Find out what's really the situation and then address it accordingly. Another very important point for young women is, plan your career pragmatically. It is important for women to have a plan, to be mindful of the life stages where they will face perhaps greater challenges in balancing the personal and professional dimension. Because if you're prepared for the challenges to come, you'll find it easier to negotiate around them. Because there will be challenges. There will be challenges for male careers too. So, it's important to sort of be aware of them. And just before I end on this point, Kashish, I think I also want to make a special note for the established women leaders out there, because I really feel that successful women have a special responsibility. They need to spread the success to other women. I congratulate women who've made it to the board, for instance, but I always say, how many more have you brought in after you, got to this exalted position? because it needs to go beyond just providing inspirational role models for younger women. It has to be about active sponsorship. We talk about the fact that women are under-sponsored and over-mentored, and that's true. So you need to put young women forward, carve out opportunities for them, use your own networks for actively furthering their careers.